Jeff, if you'd like to take the reins, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ross. My name is Jeff Jenks. I've been growing tomatoes and peppers in Cupertino since 1995, and I've been a master gardener since 2013. And by the way, just for note, chili is the name for a pepper. So we'll be covering chilies, of course, as well as peppers. The picture you see here of the tomatoes include a harvest I had that's on my kitchen table. And you can see some green zebra right here and probably some Virginia sweet and a whole variety of plum tomatoes. And we're going to talk about all these things as we go forward. So here's what's coming up. Here's what we'll cover in our talk today. And I hope I'll make some points about each of these subjects so that you can take some notes. There will be occasions like what's about to come up where you might want to take a screenshot of the screen to capture the URLs that I'm going to suggest. So if you have your camera ready or you're ready to know how to take a screenshot, that might be appropriate because some of the information on the slides will not be in the handout. So first, I want to actually cover reseed starting, because actually, as we sit here right now in late February in a beautiful winter day in California, do we have winter in California? Not really, but this is about the time of year when you would consider doing seed starting, which means you could start your own seedlings for transplant in the ground when the time is appropriate. And we do have a couple of YouTube videos that can be very helpful to you talking about seed starting. And this is something you might want to take a screenshot of because these are not in the handout. Even though the title of one of these says a summer start for your winter garden, the seed starting part is common to both starting for a winter garden or for a summer garden. The examples may be different. Obviously, your summer vegetables include zucchini, squash, tomatoes, and peppers, and we're going to focus on tomatoes and peppers in this session today. And of course, there are other videos that I won't be using in my presentation that are relevant to tomatoes and peppers at our YouTube channel, which is shown right here in this URL. So let's go on to talk about tomatoes and peppers. One of the things that people want to know about first is now is the time when you'll be planning what you want to purchase from seedlings or what you want to start from seed. And there are a number of different parameters that regarding the different types of tomatoes. And I want to talk to you briefly about that. You've probably heard many times about hybrid tomatoes. Those are created by growers by crossing different types of tomato plants. And their purpose and goal typically is disease resistance. But you'll also find as we talk that there are other characteristics of tomatoes that are bred by the growers. For example, I used to grow the early girl hybrid here, and that got me a tomato that actually was pickable typically in even June. It had a good flavor, probably as good as anything in the store, but it wasn't the outstanding flavor that I typically would like in a tomato I grew myself. Then the other thing you'll hear people talk about are heirloom tomatoes. And the master gardeners themselves, when we have our spring garden market, tend to specialize in starting transplants for heirloom tomatoes. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we're not going to have our spring garden market this year. And we're very disappointed that we aren't. But when you go to the store, you will find heirloom tomato seedlings available. And I've asked many master gardeners, what exactly is an heirloom tomato? And they've told me that an heirloom tomato is an open pollinated tomato. I said, well, what does that mean? It says, it means if you save the seeds, then the next year when you plant those seeds, you'll get the same type of tomato. And I said, well, that's good. And they said, the other thing is an heirloom tomato is a tomato with a story. I used to grow a tomato called the Nebraska Wedding Heirloom Tomato. As you can probably guess, the tomato was developed in Nebraska, and it was a wedding gift to newlyweds. And I have saved the seeds for that. And it's an unusual tomato because it's kind of an apricot colored skin. And the flavor is good. Now, the other important characteristic that you'll hear about is indeterminate versus determinate. And why is this important? Well, an indeterminate tomato type will keep growing until the frost kills it, or lack of sun and water kill it. So that means you'll get multiple opportunities to harvest tomatoes during the growing season, which starts typically in April, May, with a harvest as early as probably June, and an indeterminate tomato type will be harvestable all the way up till October, maybe even early November, depending on how the weather and the conditions change. A determinate tomato, on the other hand, will have one growth season, meaning depending on the days to harvest, you'll get one crop all at the same time, and then the plant will die. Indeterminate tomato plants can grow as high as 7 feet. A determinate tomato plant will typically grow between 3 and 4 feet. So one of the things you should do as you're planning your layout for your garden of tomatoes is you'll want to put, as we're going to talk about in a moment, if your planter is going to, the tomatoes are going to grow to the south. They're sun-seeking, so they're going to grow to the south. So you should put your indeterminate types behind your determinate types, so when they grow tall, they don't shade each other, meaning the taller ones will shade the shorter ones. Now, one more thing that isn't on this diagram here that I have heard questions about in the past is, what about grafted tomatoes? Well, grafted tomatoes are available in the nurseries. Typically, the grower there used a rootstock that has great disease resistance and grafted a better tasting tomato onto it. And I haven't had any direct experience with this. They typically cost more as a seedling. So make your own choice about that. If you think you might have a soil problem, then considering a grafted tomato seedling would be good. The other characteristics that we talk about in tomatoes are the shape of the fruit. So you'll hear talks about cherry tomatoes and beefsteak. Beefsteak are the big ones. Sometimes there's a size called classic salad size. There's also grape-shaped tomatoes, plum, also called paste tomatoes. And the plum and paste tomatoes are generally for people who think they want to make a sauce, because they're much more, they're meaty and they have fewer seeds. And some of them can even be box-shaped, like Ernie's plum, which generally isn't available these days, but I've grown it in the past. So just to summarize here, the indeterminates go behind the determinants in your planting plan. And if you do get some heirloom tomatoes, you'll have the opportunity to save seeds. Don't bother to save the seeds from the hybrid, because they will not come up true the next year, as I've learned firsthand. You might get some pretty interesting tomatoes that way and start your own named variety, but it's not guaranteed. So let's talk now about chilies and peppers. Again, chili is the name for a pepper. The types here are sweet and spicy or hot. And the characteristic for the sweet peppers that are not spicy is that the heat level is 0. And these are what you find called bell peppers or horn-shaped red, yellow, orange, green peppers. We'll have some pictures of those in a moment. Then chili peppers, which are sometimes what people refer to for the hot ones, have a range of heat from 100 to 3.2 million SHU or Scoville scale. That's this word here. They're not marked that way, so you need to do your homework. If you're going to buy a hot pepper, you're going to need to know what they're not going to put that on the label in the store. Now, as we know, peppers are very important as they reflect the cuisine of many countries. For example, Mexico, and perhaps one of its most popular peppers is the jalapeno, which here in the US, we've grown and made very popular with what's called sriracha sauce, whose base pepper is the jalapeno. And then you'll also find peppers that originate from other countries and make a huge difference in the flavor of their foods. So I'm sure some of you out there are saying, yes, I want to grow peppers that reflect the cuisine of a country I might have visited, or maybe of the country I grew up in, or maybe this is something that reminds me of my parents or my grandparents, or dishes that I had in a restaurant on a vacation. And I've had some wonderful meals in restaurants using peppers as the principal flavor for a terrific meal. So here's some examples in pictures of the different types of chilies and peppers. Somehow there's sometimes a contest as to what's the hottest pepper. And I'll have to warn you that I'm not a fan of hot peppers myself, so I don't participate in those contests. And I did read online that if you eat the ghost pepper too quickly, it can damage your esophagus. So I do that very carefully if you decide you want to become an aficionado of very extremely hot peppers. Here's our jalapeno right here. I had a wonderful fish dish that was flavored with the ancho poblano pepper, and it had a little bit of spice, but not much. Personally, I grow mostly sweet, both bell and non-bell peppers. And I do that because I have 2 grandchildren, and I like them to be able to come over and pick a pepper and just eat it like an apple, just start chomping on it the minute they get here, which they do. So now let's talk about some gardening issues. Maybe the most important thing for site selection is the sun. And one of our challenges here in Silicon Valley as our neighborhoods mature is that we have trees that keep growing and growing and growing on our neighbors' yards and providing more and more shade to the areas we want to grow our tomatoes and peppers in. In fact, I know one fellow I'm friends with in Los Altos who said, you know, I'm going to have to give up growing my tomatoes. The neighbors' trees have gotten so tall that I just don't get enough sun. Well, how much sun do you need? Well, you need a minimum of 8 hours for a beefsteak. That's the big ones. You need a minimum of 6 hours of direct sun for the cherry and grape types of tomatoes. And for the plum and paste, again, you're going to need a minimum of 8 hours. And one way to make sure you're getting enough sun is you really want to have your planting bed to be in direct sun at noon. And in my case, and you'll see some pictures of my planting bed, it's actually on the east side of my property. And therefore, it really doesn't do well as a place for winter vegetables because it only gets a couple hours of sun during the winter. But fortunately, in the summer, it does get over 8 hours until the house gets in the way and blocks the afternoon sun. So as I mentioned before, they are sun seekers, both peppers and tomatoes. And as such, we will see late in the program that they can be damaged by the sun, the fruit can. So you want lots of foliage. Now, I don't know how many of you are planning to grow in the ground, or how many of you are planning to grow in raised beds, or how many of you are planning to grow in containers, but there are some guidelines. I put these dimensions here in part because this is the dimensions by which you can buy gopher wire or hardware cloth to protect your raised beds from gophers, which is going to be late in the program, but is a problem for me even today. Last year on my property in Cupertino, I trapped 12 gophers. So every one of my raised beds for any of my vegetables, summer or winter, have gopher wire or hardware cloth. Half-inch hardware cloth is good on the bottom of the planter. For tomatoes, a nice big beefsteak tomato will put down a taproot as long as 2 feet. So if you can get your raised bed to be 2 feet deep, even if it's on our native soil, you'll have a better success and better luck with your growing season. Now, for a tomato, you're better off with a planter, and I'm going to do a little drawing, which is probably not a good idea, that's 2 feet deep and not terribly wide, than one that's only 1 foot deep. And the other thing on containers is you're better off for the container not to have a saucer underneath it, or have a built-in water receptacle. And I say that because you don't want your roots from your tomato plant or your pepper plant to be sitting in water any part of the day. So when you water, and we'll talk about that more when we get to irrigation, if you water your tomato plant and there's water in the saucer, now you may want to have the saucer to protect the deck or the aggregate that you're going to put it on. By the way, if you put it out on the dirt, one of the things to watch out for is that your trees that are nearby will send roots up through the hole, and they will circle the bottom of this and suck all the nutrients and water it can out of your nice rich soil for your tomato and pepper. So you really want to put these up on some bricks off the ground if you're going to put them on soil. Now, the other thing on containers, as we know from our container classes, is it is a good idea to put the insect screen in the bottom of the container to keep out the insects and to keep the soil in, but you don't need to put any broken crockery or rocks or anything. You want to use as much of the volume of the container for your potting mix. And for containers, the recommended soil type is potting mix, not planting mix, potting mix. Same for peppers. Later, we'll get to the amendments and the fertilizers you want to add to your mix here. All right. So let me just repeat again on containers. For tomatoes, taller is better. Never put stones or broken ceramic in there. For peppers, 1 foot's good enough. And we'll see more about that later. So here's some examples of raised beds. I've been encouraged to show some of my own raised beds. This is my big raised bed right here. I inherited this raised bed when I'm the second owner of this property. And when I came here on the east side in a nice section of the property, there was this beautiful 7 foot by 11 foot raised bed. So I said, well, I'm going to keep that. And I built around it this pine 12-inch by, well, it's a 12 by, so it's 1.5 inches wide, 12 inches deep. And you can get it as long as 12 feet. And so that's this piece here, that's 12 feet long right there, or 11.5 feet. And then I put in these to separate sections of it. So when I want to reach in to try and harvest any kind of tomatoes, I can step on these boards and not compress the soil. Now, I try and plant too many plants each year. So this 4x4 area right here has 4 plants in it. And frankly, when they all grow up, I can barely ever get at this one right here. And so I usually lose most of the tomatoes on that, but we'll talk about that some more. Here's that dimensions I talked about down here. That's the dimensions where, again, this one's only 1 foot. And so actually what I've done is on one of these, and you'll see this in a later picture, I've added another 8 inches because I had some wood to do. Now, if I could do this planter over, I would have made it 2 feet deep. And I would have done it like these that are beautiful raised beds in a community garden. And these are in the San Tomas Monroe community garden. And these were recently built a couple of years ago, and they're absolutely gorgeous, terrifically well done. Now, this example down here is how I grow my peppers. This is an earth box. Again, you want to use potting soil in an earth box. One more thing, and we're about to move on to this in the soil section. I've had some pretty poor success myself with soils that were named in the nursery as for raised beds. It's not appropriate to name names, but one of them I used that I put in a planter in this shape not only gave me pretty good results with the vegetables I grew, but a full crop of very large mushrooms. And that's probably because the soil was made with mushroom compost and it wasn't properly composted itself. So same is true here. I used a raised bed soil in my earth boxes and got terrible results with stem rot, which we'll see at the very end. So this year, I'm sure to use potting mix in my earth boxes and potting mix in my raised beds. Now, there are other vendors that have raised bed soils, and you can find them online. And in some cases, you may want to get delivery of a significant amount, depending on how big your raised beds are going to be. But make sure that it's been designed for raised beds. But if you can get something that's closer to a potting mix, you'll be better suited. I should mention that all of these have gopher wire underneath them that are mine, except the earth box doesn't need gopher wire because it's self-contained. Here's some tomatoes in containers. I personally don't do tomatoes in containers, but these are some great results. You can see them here. Something to point out is that, again, as I mentioned, in this picture here, you see that none of these have anything underneath them. So they get really good drainage out the hole. None of them have any of those saucers or those self-contained water reservoirs. This is an interesting design right here with a hanging plant. I've also read about the upside down hanging plants. They can work. The thing is, that's a challenge is that with the summer heat and wind, they're going to dry out really fast. And so you may actually even need to water them more than once a day if you want to get a good crop, because they'll dry out really quickly. Again, here, another thing to note here is that this one, they felt a cage. You can see it just outlined right here because they wanted to keep the fruit off the soil, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about. That was important in this case with this particular container. Obviously, again, I would have liked these containers to be a little bit taller, although it looks to be at least 18 inches tall. But the good news is they had really good drainage. So that's good. That's really important. Oops. Soil. This is the time of year when you've got to start getting your soil ready. In fact, I missed the window to plant a cover crop in those planters of mine. That should have been done back in November, but I missed it again. So now we need to talk about, well, what am I going to do now? Well, I'm not going to read this to you because you can read, I'm sure. One of the important things to note here is this word calcium. And that's going to be recurring in my presentation because it's an important nutrient for both tomatoes and peppers. The other thing we want to talk about is what soil temperature before you transplant. Now, here I live in Cupertino, and since I'm talking to an audience, hopefully mostly in Santa Clara County, you're going to want the soil to warm up to the point where the nighttime temperature isn't getting too far below 55 degrees. And typically for me in Cupertino, that's meant I start my transplants into my raised beds after I've started the transplants from seed. I usually transplant in mid-April through May. And I've talked to some other master gardeners and other gardeners that are friends of mine, and they confirm the same thing. If you're in the South County and you get greater excursions on your temperatures, you may want to wait until at least May 1st. If you're in a warm area like Cupertino, where I am, maybe by mid-April, it won't have much effect if you wait until even mid to late May to plant. Yes, you will be missing out on some of the longer days with lots of sun, but most of the time, your days to maturity are going to be in the 90 to 110 days. So you're going to end up having your tomatoes start yielding in late July, August, September. If you get started earlier, you might get some, and you use early girl variety, for example, you may get them as early as late June. Now, again, good drainage is really important in pots. I can't stop emphasizing that. So I'm going to repeat myself there a couple times. Let's go on. Compost. For those of you that are going to grow in the ground, our natural soil in Santa Clara County is typically clay. And tomatoes have a hard time growing in clay. They also want the organic material you get with compost. So if you're going to grow in the ground, you probably want to, for tomatoes, you want to grow at least, well, not at least, up to 2 feet deep would be great for the big beefsteak tomatoes. Maybe a foot for the cherry and grape tomatoes. And you want to make sure it's compost. These numbers show you how you can start your own by calling the rot line. I'm not sure they're active right now. You can get free compost at the Smart Station if you live in Sunnyvale, Mountain View, or Palo Alto. Cupertino has free compost, but they have a schedule for you to pick it up yourself on typically Fridays and Saturdays, and you need to know when they're open. I couldn't find any free compost in San Jose, but I could find places where you can purchase it, and certainly the nurseries sell compost. Okay, compost is really important, and you're going to want to amend the clay soil by up to 30% volume with compost. Now let's talk about soil amendments and fertilizers. So here's my 30% of soil volume compost. This applies to raised beds as well. Not so much for containers where you're going to buy a potting soil. So a potting soil, you don't need to add compost to that. Now in the planting hole itself, these are the different options you have. And we're going to talk some more about some details about this. If you just amend your soil with compost and you plant your tomato seedlings without additional fertilizer, you won't get a good result. There won't be enough nitrogen in particular for the plant to thrive. Now, all of these are available as products, which we'll see in a moment. And we'll see how much nitrogen is in each one of them. So you can read these. This is my favorite word to try and pronounce, mycorrhizal fungi. And they're available commercially, and they've been determined to be a great enhancement to your soil to help with root growth. So let me say a few things about what not to add to your soil. Number one, human waste, do not add to your soil. Pet waste, do not add to your soil. Critter waste, like rat, rabbit, bird, do not add that to your soil. If you've used any herbicides like crabgrass inhibitors, do not add that to your soil in the form of things you may have dug up. Shredded redwood is not good for your soil. Uncomposted horse manure. So if you live near a horse farm and the stables are being mucked out, do not put the horse manure in your soil now. It's too late. You could have done it back in November to let it compost in your soil, but it's too late now. You can purchase composted horse manure. Uncomposted chicken droppings. So if you have a neighbor that has chicken droppings and they say, would you like these for your garden? Not now. They need to be composted. Don't use wood chips and don't use hay. If you need to use a mulch, we'll talk about that a little bit later, use straw. Now, peppers, after the initial fertilizer in the planting hole, and I personally use this one here, 16, 16, 16, but I only use 1 tablespoon in each planting hole. And that's all I do in terms of additional nitrogen and NPK. NPK is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in my raised beds. Now, generally speaking, organic fertilizers are better for the soil than synthetic fertilizers. We'll talk about that in a moment. And if there are questions about other choices, please put those in the chat. And there are directions on earth boxes as to how much fertilizer to add to the top of the soil. And when you fill the box with your soil, and I follow those directions and they seem to work out well. So here's some soil amendments that I just talked about. I'm in no way recommending any of these. I'm simply providing you with these as examples. But I will tell you the ones I've used. I have used both. I have used some of these in the past, and last year I did use this one in particular. Sorry, this one right here. And the reason, I liked what was in it. So let me see if I can. Well, the things I liked about it was that it had a good deal of calcium in it. So this one here is 10-5-15 in terms of NPK. It had a good deal of calcium. It had some sulfur. It had quite a bit of organic material, kelp, earthworm castings, feather meal, bone meal. And I worked this into the top layer of the soil. So this is the time when these didn't go in the hole. These are soil amendments I spread on the top of my soil, and I worked them into the top 6 inches of the soil. And in my case, I used a rototiller. You could use a rake. A friend of mine last year did one of his raised beds with steer manure and one with chicken manure. And he says he got better results with the steer manure. That was a compost blend, but those could be different. Okay. And I was disappointed, though, that when I used this shake and feed from Miracle Grow, even with the calcium that was added and the sulfur, that it still didn't stop my blossom end rot problem, a problem we'll talk about later. So these are some examples of soil amendments that you can put in the soil now, work them into the soil now. And then this is before you plant the transplants. But for me, the first thing I need to do is I need to repair my raised beds, which we'll see in a moment or see a little bit later. Here are the fertilizers that I am not suggesting or recommending, but these are ones that people have used who have had good results with growing tomatoes and peppers. This blood meal right here is one suggested by one of our master gardeners who's had good success. You can see here it's 1200, so it's just a source of nitrogen. I looked up what worm castings have in terms of NPK, and they're 100. So while they're terrific from a organic fertilizer point of view, you're going to need a good deal of it to get your plants the amount of nitrogen they want. Here's another organic natural fertilizer, which is 542. This one is one you make into a liquid, and it is the specific one for tomatoes. This is another soil amendment. Actually, I put it in the hole this past year, and I did it because it does have some mycorrhizal fungi in it. And it's rated, let's see, it contains blood meal, feather meal, bone meal, dried chicken manure, bat guano, alfalfa, potassium humic, a lot of good stuff, and I kind of like it. And it's really helping out with transplant shock. So when you put your seedling in the hole, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, it's going to go through a period of time where it's going to adjust make an adjustment for its root system between the soil you may have started it in or you bought it in the soil and your planter. And then alfalfa pellets are one of the favorites of my friend who's a pepper expert. And they're 212, but they're organic and you can apply them at any time. So he likes to apply them regularly through the season in the pepper beds he has. Now I should make a quick note here that the water requirements for tomatoes and peppers are quite different. So you should think about that as you're planning your irrigation system, that you're not going to want to have the tomatoes and peppers on the same irrigation timer or same system. So that's what we're talking about next. We're going to have a little diagram that shows what it means to plant a tomato seedling so half the stem is buried in the hole. This is only the case for tomatoes. With pepper seedlings, plant them at soil level to avoid stem rot. And you can plant doublets. That means you can plant 2 peppers in the same hole. Sometimes you do that with different colored peppers so you know which is which. We're going to talk about time drip irrigation. In my case, we're going to have a picture of my hookup for timed drip irrigation, and you should only water in the morning. One of the reasons for that is you want to let the soil dry out to allow oxygen to get to the roots at night. The roots need oxygen at night, so they need airspace at night. So don't water in the evening. And then for tomatoes only, I've come up after many years of experimentation that I should cut back my watering on July 1st. Initially, during the first, in my case, 10 weeks after transplanting on April 15th, I gave my tomato seedlings 1 quart of water each every morning at 6 a.m. How did I calculate that? I had a timer and I had ½ gallon per hour drippers for each plant. And we'll see where I put the drippers for each plant. And I ran the timer for 30 minutes. So the equation goes ½ gallon per hour times 30 minutes is 1/4 gallon of water, which is 1 quart. Now, we're going to talk in a moment about it. We'll see in a moment something that I do to keep that water in the soil, which is I do use a weed cloth as a mulch. And I have a picture of that in a moment. Peppers are going to put in the ground a little bit later than your tomatoes, in part because they want warmer soil and higher temperatures. And here's something that isn't on the slide, but has been tested by our master gardeners. For peppers, you pinch the blossoms for the first 2 weeks to redirect the growth to the roots and the leaves, and you'll get more roots and you get more greenery and roots. And by doing this, you'll get the same amount of fruit. So I'm going to say it again. A study by a master gardener research garden showed that picking off blossoms and fruits for 6 weeks more than doubled the production and getting ripe peppers. So again, talking about irrigation watering, the plants use the carbon dioxide in the air to make sugars and starches for the plant. And the roots need oxygen to stay healthy. So you want to make sure that they have a chance to dry out overnight. Not dry out, but at least give air spaces to the roots. And you never want your soil to get so wet that it becomes anaerobic and smells bad. But you'll know that because all the plants will die. So here's what we talked about in terms of planting for the stem. So if you get your seedling and you see that it's kind of leggy like this, it's really tall, you can plant it so the soil level is right here and you've planted this much of the stem in the ground. And you don't need to remove these extra leaves here. They will simply die. And this way, they will actually, over time, roots will start to come out of this part of the stem in the ground. So you don't need to tear these leaves off or even cut them off, these particular leaves. They will simply disintegrate in the soil. But this is only for a tomato. Only for a tomato. For peppers, you want to plant them at soil level. Here's my time drip irrigation system. Let me show you the parts of it with my drawing here. You can't quite see it. Well, yes, you can. Right here is the backflow preventer that is required in the city of Cupertino for all of your hose connections outdoors, so that the water from your irrigation system doesn't get into the primary water supply for the city of Cupertino. I do put a Y right here because I want to have a hose for additional watering purposes. Then here is my timer right here. This is a battery operated timer. And this particular brand, I can get through a whole season on one battery. This is an important addition to your stream of your water. This is a filter. And it's really important to have this filter on here because the water is going to go to these drippers. And this year I'm faced with having to do some PVC pipe repair in my irrigation system. And one year when I did that, I went to clear this filter, which you need to do periodically, probably at least once a month. And I found all the shavings from my cutting of the PVC pipe had been caught by the filter, which is a very fine filter. And I was thankful for that because it would have clogged all the drippers in my drip system for my tomatoes and would have ruined my drip system. So the filter is very important. It also happens to be it's not only a filter, but it's also a pressure reducer. The water pressure, fortunately for me in Cupertino, is 30 PSI. The pressure, though, for the drippers wants to be around 15 or less. So this pressure reducer reduces it from 30 to 15. And that's really critical, too. Otherwise, your drippers won't drip properly or they'll get blown off and you'll end up with leaks. And then there I have two circuits. You can see it a little bit here. There are two circuits for two lines that go out to my beds. So let's see what that looks like. Oh, well, here's another generalization, and this also covers containers. Water near the root system, not the foliage. So you can see yourself, this is wrong, this is right. Again, cut back on the watering as the plant begins to fruit, but you want to maintain watering for peppers. So these are good images here of how to water. Oh, I thought there was going to be another picture here of my drippers. Maybe it comes later. Oh, wait, there it is. Hold on a second. Oh, I missed it. I'm sorry. Let me go back to it. Here it is. Sorry. I did want to show this because, you saw, so going back again here, sorry. We showed this one and I showed you that the lines come out like this. And what I wanted to show you next was, where is it? There it is. Sorry. This is the dripper. So let me show you where the dripper is. A little hard to see. Right here is that half-gallon per hour dripper right here. And you can see that it's really close to the stem. And I put it there initially because when you transplant a 4-inch pot, all the roots are within 2 inches of the stem. So you want to have the dripper within 2 inches of the roots so that the water is getting on the roots. Later in the season, I might move it out further in the planter here because the roots will have spread underneath in the soil. You also see here this black plastic weed cloth, which I use on my raised beds. I'm not sure I pointed that out before, but I use this in place of straw mulch. And I just have one thing I don't like about gardening consistently is I don't like the weed. By putting in this weed cloth, I don't have to weed through the whole season. So there's the dripper in the raised bed. I wanted to show that. And then we showed you a general lot of water. Now we're on to the good part. We're in the home stretch here a little bit. Pollination. Here's some good news. Tomato and pepper plant flowers are self-pollinated. That means you don't have to do anything if there's a little bit of wind. Buzz pollinators. Certain bees can help with pollination. And I was brought up on some of my master gardeners who know more about insects than I do told me that there are only a couple of types of buzz pollinators that are good for tomatoes. And those are carpenter bees and bumblebees. So I have a story to tell about carpenter bees. I always like to talk to the carpenter bees in my garden, my tomato garden in the summertime. But then I learned that where they like to build their nests is they like to burrow into untreated wood. And I found that in my planting bench that I had untreated wood, so they had bored holes into the planks in the surface of my planting hutch. And actually the holes were almost as big as my pinky finger in terms of width. And they went in about 8 inches. So over time, that plank was going to disintegrate completely. So I just painted the ends, and I still thank my carpenter bees for all the good work they do. This looks to be more like a bumblebee right here. Now, another thing that some people have suggested is that if you're in a place where all your tomato plants are incredibly insulated from the wind, that maybe you should give them a shake when the flowers are open in the middle of the day. I haven't had a need to do that, but if you're suspecting that there's been no wind for a very long time and the flowers have all come out, then perhaps it's time to consider giving them a tiny shake when the flowers are open. They close at night and they're open during the day. But I personally haven't had to do that, but I've read that that is something you can consider. Staking and caging. You want to keep all the fruit off the ground. As I mentioned, an indeterminate tomato plant can grow as tall as 7 feet. These are cages that I personally haven't used, and I think you can buy these commercially. They're good. Many times people will put 2 plants in the hole for these, typically of different colored fruit, so you can follow what their growth pattern is. They do need a good deal of support because the fruit get quite heavy. I think I had a tomato last year that was over a pound, or maybe even almost 2 pounds. And they're going to need support from your staking and caging. The point of this slide, one of the points of this slide that Master Gardeners did a study on was whether you need a cage or you can just do a stake. And our study showed there was no difference. So that's good. Personally, I use the V-shaped cages, and they work pretty well. Remember again that the terminates aren't going to grow much higher than 4 feet, 3 to 4 feet, but your indeterminates could grow as high as 6 feet. So you might want a bigger cage there. And as I showed in one of the pictures, even some of the smaller dwarf size container tomatoes might need a little support. You never want the fruit to touch the soil. That's another benefit of my weed cloth, is that they don't let the tomatoes touch the soil. And another thing I do on my bed is that as the tomatoes grow and they grow out of the cages, I have to put up stakes along the outside of the planter and use green tape to hold the tomatoes in as they go on their sun-seeking way to try and fall out onto the ground. Chilies, if they're small and bushy, may not need support. And another thing you want to be sure of here is that I've been asked a number of times about pruning tomatoes, and my direct answer is don't prune tomatoes, because as we're going to see later, you'll get problems with sun scald. And the same is true for peppers. You want as much foliage as possible. Now, there's some people that will disagree with me on that, but they're going to spend a lot of time pruning, and they may result in a serious physiological problem called sun scald. I do prune any leaves or branches that die, and as the plant grows to up to 6 feet tall, the lower branches may shrivel up and die and turn brown, and those you can remove, mostly because they're just not look very good. So these are available in different of the stores and nurseries and different places in the Bay Area. Another one of my favorites, pests. So I took these pictures actually this week of, let me show you what I'm talking about here. I've got a busy gopher right here. I haven't figured out quite how I'm going to get to him or her. You can see here on this raised bed that I did extend it another 8 inches to make it deeper. I know for a fact last year I trapped 12 gophers. So they and I have a relationship, meaning I know that there's a gopher tunnel that runs right along the fence line. In fact, that's one of their favorites. They like to put their tunnels where they have good support from above. So they like to go right under the fence line. That makes it even harder to get at them. Here's another example of the corner. And you can see that this pine wood was not a good choice for the raised bed here. In fact, the best woods for raised beds are cedar, redwood, or Trex, which is actually vinyl plastic, which the master gardeners have used, and Trex lasts the longest. What you can see here is that here's my gopher wire, and you can see that my wood is completely deteriorated and corroded here after many years of contact with the soil. So I have this really big project ahead of me of reinforcing the inside of my planter with some new wood. Fortunately, I have some leftover fence planks that I'm going to use to reinforce this, and then tack the gopher wire to it so the gopher can't get in, because the gopher wanted to come in this way and up here, and then he wanted to get into my planter and terrorize all of my tomato plants. I've discovered that I had 2 rabbits in my backyard, which I try and not let rabbits into, but I do have a rabbit place they live in my holly in the front yard, so I try and keep them out with fencing. I did finally have to trap them. I used a have-a-heart trap. Rats. I've had a terrible problem with rats as I live in Cupertino. I think my count this year on rats was less than 6. One year I had 25 rats that I trapped. Don't poison them, because if you poison them, they'll go someplace to die, and then they'll get eaten by another animal that might be poisoned by the poison. Or in my case, one year, the rats decided they would die in the wall of my house, next to the hot water line in the wall by the washer. So I had a person come out, tear out the wall, remove the rat, and chlorinate the area. So don't poison them, because as they die, they look for a warm place to die. Birds, well, they usually aren't much of a problem, except late in the season when your fruit's near the top of the plant and the birds fly over, see this beautiful red fruit, and they come down and peck at it. I call this acceptable loss, meaning I just don't do much about it. I suppose you could put up some shade cloth or you could build a whole place you want to have them inside of, but for me, that hasn't been the case. I'll just accept that. So that's the deal with pests. It's a constant battle. Now, here's some physiological problems. By that, I mean, these are not disease related or insect related. These are related to how the plant was grown. And as I mentioned before, sun scald is a problem for tomatoes and peppers. I think this is sun scald. It could also be blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is maybe the most frustrating one. I've spent a lot of time studying what causes blossom end rot. And the best thing I can tell you is that I did find an excellent paper that I reread this morning that talks about how complex a problem it is. And the paper basically convinced me that the problem typically is related to your watering and timing of your watering, and the fact that the plant can't get enough calcium to grow the fruit at the same time as it's trying to grow its leaves and stems. So my own personal experience has been that I've gotten a good deal of blossom end rot until I've understood it better. So a few things I thought would help that it turns out don't help is, since it's a shortage of calcium in the fruit growing section of the plant, I thought, well, I'll add a lot more calcium to my soil. That had no good effect whatsoever. In fact, it may have had a negative effect by raising the pH of my soil. Another thing is that I overheard a conversation once at a nursery where someone came in and said, "What have you got for blossom end rot?" And they sold them a few dollars worth of calcium sprays to put on the whole plant. And the article I read from the master gardeners said those don't make any difference whatsoever because the plant can't transfer the calcium from the leaves and stems to the fruit, so you just wasted your money. Cat facing is really kind of another problem that can occur. That tends to be variety specific and mostly on your big tomatoes. One thing to point out though on blossom end rot is that I've never seen blossom end rot on a cherry tomato. So if you're just getting started with tomatoes and you're going to do them in containers, I highly recommend you start with cherry tomato varieties. Your nurseries will have a good selection of those. They'll be in different colors, and they won't have some of the problems that the big tomatoes have, like the plum tomatoes and the beefsteak tomatoes. One of the things that's also been discovered is that blossom end rot tends to be related to the type of tomato. So for example, I made a short video last summer where I showed a very disappointing orange beefsteak tomato that had been ruined by blossom end rot. And I pointed out that I've had this same problem year to year in this same place in my planter. So two things I should know now that I will do this year, which is I won't plant orange beefsteak tomatoes in that part of my planter. And I may not even try and grow orange tomatoes at all, just because they tend to be more susceptible, in my case, to blossom end rot. And we have other master gardeners who have trialed different tomatoes side by side of, say, the same type, a plum tomato of one variety and a plum tomato of another one right next to each other in the same soil in the ground. One got blossom end rot, one didn't. So it can be variety specific. Okay. So this cat facing is caused by uneven soil moisture and sun exposure during a rapid growth phase. It's not so bad. Just cut around these hard spots when you want to eat it. And some varieties are more susceptible than others. All righty. Then the really nasty ones we have a book in our library at the Master Gardeners that talks about the 1,000 diseases tomatoes can get. That's too depressing for me to read. So these are the most common ones that might occur, both insects wise. I have seen the tomato hornworm once. They're really quite spectacular in terms of their size, and they're very evident, and they'll eat the entire plant. But the good news is if you just grab them, throw them on the ground, let the crows come and eat them, then you're all set. You don't need to spray them with anything. Just pull them off and feed them to your birds. They'll like them. Russet mite damage, if you think you have it, best thing to do is call our help desk to confirm you have it. There is a treatment for it, but it's a big deal to do it. These other ones, most of the time, by the time you see it on the leaves, it's too late. Here's one, though, that I like because it tells me something is this tobacco mosaic virus is actually spread by tobacco smoke. So if any of you are smokers, don't smoke in your garden. That's about all I can say about that. But the most important thing here is that the breeders have bred tomatoes for years that resist these different diseases. And therefore, you want to pick varieties that are disease resistant. And there are a whole set of those. That's a whole presentation in and of itself to talk about the different diseases and the disease resistance. Their nurseries who provide guarantees on their plants are going to provide you with the ones that are probably best for our climate as well as best from a disease resistance point of view, because they don't want to have to give you their money back, give you your money back. This is my saddest disease. And I went out of my way to learn how to say Phytophthora, say that 3 times fast, capsicum. This is crown and root rot. Again, this has been a problem for me in my earth boxes and others. And once the plant exhibits this stem condition, it's gone. You'll just have to pull it and replace it. This last year, I had it occur in most of the peppers I put in my earth boxes because I used the wrong soil. And it is spread by too much moisture. And I thought I could overcome it by giving it some water in some other directions. And all it did was tease me by looking a little bit better for a couple of days, then it completely flopped. So then I replaced them. And fortunately, even though it's a soil-borne mold, they did fine. I guess the ones I replaced it with had that disease resistance to that particular mold. But it's really important, if you get any of these problems, to contact our help desk. And this is one maybe you want to take a quick snapshot of, which is the URL for you to make a submission by email to our help desk. Sorry, I'm going to erase that so you can read it. Basically, they're going to want you to sort of do a little sleuthing and figure out what you think the disease is, then send some pictures, and then they'll follow up with you. And they'll do an excellent job, an absolutely excellent job helping you with the diseases you might have. All right, we're in the home stretch here. Pruning, picking, and storing. I think I've already said this. You can prune dead leaves and branches. In terms of picking, you kind of want to know what color your pepper or chili is so you'll know when it's ripe, because you have green, red, orange, yellow peppers. You can pick a tomato when it's green, and it will continue to ripen. At least it'll continue to turn red. But many times people will tell me the flavor wasn't as good if I didn't let it go all the way to full ripeness. Some peppers picked green. In fact, I let my peppers in my earth box that were still going go all the way through, what are we in, February? And I picked one even in early February that was mostly green, and it's turning a nice red. Of course, if you leave them on the vine too long, they will rot. Now, having said that, a tomato that's just started to rot might be a good candidate for saving seeds, because that tomato will have gotten to the point where all the seeds inside of it are mature enough to consider saving. Now, peppers are perennials, And many of the hot peppers and the master gardeners that grow them tell me, well, you know, Jeff, I keep these in the ground and they overwinter, and I do a little pruning and I fertilize and I get a great crop the next year. Not so with tomatoes. I haven't heard any stories, anecdotal stories telling me that they can do the same thing with tomatoes, but some of the peppers, they can be good year to year. And you'll have to send us a question and we'll find someone that can tell you which varieties they've had success there with, if we can. And we have some experts in peppers in our organization. All right. So here's one to take a screenshot of, because this is our second to last slide. There's more information on our Master Gardener website. And this is specific to Santa Clara County, as all Master Gardener organizations are. We're all county specific. So this is the Master Gardener website right there. And then we have, of course, all these URLs. And we have a YouTube channel with quite a few presentations. This one itself may appear on the YouTube channel in a short time. We have some excellent presentations as well as short videos, as well as instructional videos on our YouTube channel. We're active on Facebook. And we have an Instagram account. And the only way I found to get to it was to click on the link and enter you have to have an account to get to our Instagram. We typically repost a lot of our Facebook posts on Instagram. So these are all great resources for more information. And I think we're ready for some questions. All right, thank you for coming.
Jeff, we have lots of questions.
All righty.
So I'm sure people will type in some more, but I'm going to go through the ones that have already come through. And we won't get to all of these. I'm trying to pick the ones that are the most relevant or most critical, I think. But first of all, what are the top 3 to 4 tomatoes to grow in the South Bay?
Well, the easiest to grow will be cherry tomatoes. And I happen to be fond of a specific hybrid cherry tomato that you can buy seeds for called Sun Gold. And I've shared that seedling with many people and gotten great feedback that they love the flavor. It's a hybrid and it's indeterminate and it grows a lot. Personally, I think everyone's choice of what's the best tomato is a very personal choice, and it would be foolhardy of me to suggest many others. I have participated in tomato tasting contests with a number of organizations. On occasion, I've won at least one category, and I've learned a lot from those contests. Maybe the most important thing on the contest, though, was did they pick the tomato when it was really ripe? So the flavor can vary dramatically. If you pick it too soon, it won't be very good. Maybe it's just green. So some others that have been favorites of mine. Well, one year the Burpees Super Beefsteak did win a contest, and it does grow well in my particular growing conditions with my particular growing techniques. That's a seed you have to buy. There's a story around that, but I think I'll go on to the next question.
Okay. Related to flavor, you did talk about cutting back the watering in July, or maybe can you go back and say, when do you cut back the watering? And how does that relate to really hot days when you need to perhaps give the plants more water so they don't die?
Yeah, so this past year I cut back the watering in the 3rd week in July, and I didn't think that was soon enough because I had a good deal of blossom end rot. So now I've determined in my own head that I should cut back the watering in July. Now, July 1st. Now, keep in mind that what I said earlier was that I started watering every day for 30 minutes to produce 1 quart of water for each plant in my planter. Now, that's after transplant and after giving it some manual watering to make sure the soil is wet. And that's another thing to make sure you get started with is since we're having a fairly dry winter, and in my raised beds, the soil is probably really dry, it's going to be important as I do my soil amendments and as I prepare for doing transplants that the soil is actually wetted and is wet. Now, if you're going in the ground, it's a different problem because there the water table may be an issue. And if the water table has dropped, as it may have because of lack of rain, then you're going to have to wet the soil in the ground as well. So this gets to one other thing, though, that maybe is a question later, is some people have said, can you dry farm tomatoes? And I've studied this a number of different ways, and I'll simply summarize it this way. If you have a soil and it's only for in the ground growing that retains a lot of water, so it's probably clay, and you have a high water table, you may get one crop of an early tomato and dry farm it, meaning you don't water at all after you get them transplanted.
Yeah.
But that's the exception, and I wouldn't give that a try because it only works in certain isolated situations. Now, the most critical thing on watering that relates to the hot, dry weather is containers. So as we know from containers, you want a container with a sun reflecting outside, meaning black is not good. You also need to be sure that it has good drainage, and you may have to water every day for a good period of time, letting the water drip out of the bottom and not be retained in a container. So watering is a tricky question and a hard one to give a definitive answer to. I used to think I knew it all on that, and then I was proven wrong. So I'm a little more tentative about giving strong advice about watering than I used to be.
When you say cut back on watering, do you mean stop watering or do you
No,
mean
let me be
water
more
less?
specific.
Thank
So in the case of this past year, I reduced the watering by 30%. What did that mean? Instead of watering 7 days a week, I watered 4.
But you kept watering, you still keep watering till
I
the
kept
plant is
watering
dead.
all the way. Well, as we know in Cupertino, our hottest weather sometimes is in August and September, particularly September. So then, yes, I would take a look, and maybe every now and then I'd say, wow, those plants are looking really, really droopy. So I'd give them 20-minute cycle of water on my drip system. Now, a better way to do it would be to use a moisture meter and go check the roots to see if they're still moist. And maybe I'll do that next time before you even give them the water. So one of the tricky parts there is, even though the plant may look pretty sad because it's starting to droop, you still may not need to water it. That's tricky.
Can we move on to pruning a little bit? Someone asked, is pinching suckers the same thing as pruning?
Let me answer it by saying a simple answer: don't bother to prune at all.
Okay, just
Unless
wanted
it's
to
a dead,
reinforce that.
unless it's a dead leaf or limb.
Okay.
So yes, I have seen videos made about pruning and talking about suckers and making it really complicated. And I guess if you're growing a 7-foot tall, indeterminate beefsteak tomato and you want to spend some time pruning it, be my guest, and the results will probably be no different. And you may get sun scald. I saw this one
Sometimes you just need to
video.
whack the top off because they're just
Oh, no, that's one thing never to do. Never cut the meristem. Never cut the top. Then the plant might die. Never cut the top. Now, you can prune the lower branches as they die. Never cut the top, or the whole plant may die.
You weren't quite clear on how far to space them apart when you're planting tomatoes.
Yeah, so the answer there is about the minimum is the width of the cage. So you can plant them so that the cages touch at the top. I've done that. What that means is that some of them will end up providing shade for the others and they won't produce. So then I tried, well, let me space them further apart. Well, they still grew so big that they shaded the others that I didn't get a very good yield. So it's kind of like minimum spacing is 18 inches, which I've done.
That's pretty
apart.
close.
Yeah, really close, maybe 2 feet. Now, if you're growing the big beefsteaks, then a little further apart and a taller cage. So my cages are only 3 or 4 feet tall, so they tend to go up and then they tend to go over. And as a result, they shade the ones behind them and in front of them. So it's tricky. I did look back at my notes, and this is why I'm more modest than I used to be. 5 or 6 years ago, I harvested 140 pounds of tomatoes and made a lot of sauce. Last year, I harvested about 40 pounds of tomatoes. I'm still trying to figure out why such a drop.
Good question. Someone had a question saying that the flowers on their tomato plants dry up regularly. What causes that?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one. I don't know the answer to that. Clearly the flower needs to blossom and then sort of be shaken or pollinated by a buzzer bee. And then you have to pray that a fruit forms. So you want as many blossoms as you can get. Now, as I mentioned, during that period of time, I'm watering daily, and I'm watering early in the morning at 6 a.m. I'm not ever watering at night. So I haven't seen that problem, but again, it's based on my watering schedule and the fact that I'm watering every day until July 1st this year.
Let's see.
Oh,
Someone
and by
says,
the way, one more thing on watering. I saw a video that talked about a commercial farmer in the Central Valley who grows tomatoes for tomato sauce, and he stops watering 3 weeks before harvest completely.
I've done that in the past. Sometimes they taste better if they don't get much water when they're finishing up ripening.
Yep. So you can consider that for your determinants, because the plant's going to produce one crop of fruit and then die.
Someone says, I have organic fertilizer 453 or 274. Is that not enough nitrogen, or is it okay?
I would say I would want to have the first number be the biggest. So I would say those. The other thing about the fertilizer is read carefully the ingredients and be sure that the type of nitrogen is nitrate and not ammoniacal.
On
nitrate.
tomatoes?
And you don't want it to be slow release either. That's another tricky thing, which is sometimes I'm asked, well, should I use Osmocote with my tomatoes? And the answer is no, there are better places for it, not tomatoes, because that's slow release. And Osmocote is balanced. It's a 16, 16, 60. Now, in my hole, I put 1 tablespoon of 16, 16, 16 general purpose fertilizer with calcium. And that's worked well for me. And it's worked better for me than a tomato specific commercial synthetic fertilizer. But I want to be careful and say there are so many variables each year that subscribing to one being the determinant variable is a little risky.
Yeah.
So the answer there is I'd prefer that fertilizer had the N number being the biggest.
Okay. Someone asks, is Miracle Grow not good? Is organic better?
Well, the plant doesn't care too much about whether it's synthetic or organic. And the soil does care a little more, because sometimes the residue from synthetic fertilizers are salts that will year to year reduce the productivity of your patch, your bed. And that could be one of my reasons why my bed doesn't yield as much each year, is that I have generally used synthetic over organic for the 30 years I've been growing tomatoes in the same place, which, by the way, is another thing you will read everywhere, is you should rotate your crops. Try and do that on your planters. I do a little bit, but not much.
We've had a couple questions about eggshells. Can you
Yes.
comment again on adding eggshells in the soil for calcium? Is that effective?
The answer is it won't hurt.
That's right. It won't hurt,
It won't hurt,
but it won't cure
but
blossom
it
end
won't do
rot.
any good either. And you'll end up with eggshells. It takes a very long time for the calcium to become available to the roots. And it won't hurt. And what I use in place of that is bone meal, which is mostly a calcium product. And again, I use a very small amount. But again, that's a lot of variables. And I would suspect that the Sure Start has a better mix of chemicals and natural ingredients in it and the mycorrhizal fungi products than the synthetic ones. And the blood meal for that matter, which I've never used, but which is recommended though by one of our master gardeners who is very successful with tomatoes.
When you use blood meal or any fertilizer, you do need to be very careful to follow the instructions on the package.
Absolutely.
Blood meal
Another
can be
thing
very
is that
hot.
with any of these chemicals, whether they're organic or whether they're synthetic, I wear water impermeable gloves, rubber gloves, not gardening gloves. And I wear a mask because the dust from all of these is not good for you. And the myth about the soil is good for your human system is a myth and not true, because we've added so many things to the soil. Now, if you want to take a mud bath someplace that uses really good mud, be my guest. But for me, that's not what I do with my hands. I keep them clean.
Just to reiterate on the eggshells, there's no problem with putting them in either the compost or in the soil. You can just mush them up, and some people even put them in the blender and make them into a powder and then just put them in the soil. It will not hurt anything. It's fine.
Yep,
yeah.
I agree.
Let's see about the self-watering containers. First of all, should you not use the reservoir if you have a self-watering container?
For tomatoes, I would say you don't want to use the self-watering container. No.
Okay. And that includes an earth box, right? So you
No,
are
well,
not an
I
earth
haven't
box
grown
fan?
tomatoes in earth boxes, but I have had friends of mine do it. And it's a little tricky. Naturally, an earth box does have a water reservoir, and it's very hard to know how you can reduce the watering. Because what happens is, as the plant grows, it puts the roots in the water, and that's what I believe can be the problem. That can be the cause of the blossom end rot. And I have friends that have done that with tomatoes with a reservoir, not necessarily an earth box, and they've had terrible blossom end rot problems.
Interesting.
Now, again, that's on blossom end rot, doesn't occur with cherry tomatoes. So you could grow cherry tomatoes in a container with a water reservoir, but you still want it to dry out overnight.
Yeah. Let's see, there were an awful lot of questions. I'm looking back. Backing up to seeds. If you have a tomato that someone has given you, either a friend or one that was really good from the store, how do you know if it was a determinate or an indeterminate? Meaning it was just the tomato. You didn't have the plant. You just had the tomato. Can you tell?
No.
You can't tell.
No. Saving seeds is its own presentation. And the biggest problem with saving seeds is making sure you don't mix them up.
Yes, you got to label them. You got to label them. So there was a question about seed saving, but I will not address that one.
No, not today.
Can you still eat the tomatoes that have blossom end rot or sun scalding?
Yes, for sun scalding more than blossom end rot. When you have blossom end rot, it's usually consumes most of the tomato, and the answer is you won't want to eat it. Sun scalding typically is more localized and you can cut around it. Blossom end rot, the flavor is going to be off too.
So as you would have expected, we had a bunch of questions about squirrels, rats, those sorts of things. One of the questions was, what do you do with the rats and gophers that you trap?
Put them in the garbage. Double bag them, put them in the garbage. That's what the garbage company told me I could do.
So I think you need to be clear. Are they alive after you trap them or dead after you trap them?
Dead.
Just wanted to be clear about that. I would like to add that if you live trap any animal on your property in California, you are not allowed to go release it somewhere else. You must deal with it on your property by law. Just
Nope,
saying.
you can't do that. And I'm not going to get into the details of all that at this point.
But you
I
just
do keep track though, as again, 12 gophers last year. I think it was 12 gophers, 5. I don't think I caught any squirrels. I don't let the squirrels in the backyard. Oh, wait, I do. Yep, squirrels too.
So I know there are people who use kill traps on squirrels, and then there are also people who will put cages over their plants to keep squirrels off. So we've had quite a few questions about squirrels. Either way, you have to keep the squirrels away from the plants.
Yeah, you do. You do. Yep. The squirrels are every bit as destructive as all the other ones. Rabbits too. I was surprised how bad the rabbits were on the tomatoes. I didn't thought they liked tomatoes as much as they do.
Of course, a rabbit would like a tomato.
The rats taunt me, but I won't go into those stories. Okay, I think we're close to the end here.
I think Ross is saying it's time to wrap it up.
Yeah,
okay, well,
I really hate to interrupt, but it's like pretty good discussion right now.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Ross.
Great. Yeah, I think we will be here for another hour or so if people are able to keep asking. But if you do have any more questions, I will be sending out the link to the help desk with the follow-up email. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you, Jeff. That was amazing. I know I myself, I'm really looking forward to now getting my hands a little dirty next week. So hopefully everyone else feels the same. And thank you, Louise, for fielding all those questions.
Thank you, Ross, and thanks to the Sunnyvale Library for being such great sponsors of our talks. They've been really faithful, and we've been working with them a lot, and we really appreciate it.
We love having you, and thank you everyone for attending. Hopefully we have more programs for you in the future. And please let us know if there's anything else you'd like us to present.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good night.